Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by...
Matt DeLuca. I'm the Vice President of Digital Strategy for Engage, a digital consulting firm down in Old Town Alexandria.
Well, thanks for coming on with me, Matt. I wanted to have you on because right now, let me just pull this up, we are 18 days from the Iowa caucus, and we are starting to speculate about what actually the campaigns are doing right now. And you are a veteran of multiple campaigns in the past, so I
Yep.
wanted to have you come on and kind of talk about what the campaigns are focusing on strategically, what a ground game is, because as a DC establishment journalist, I'm not someone who has been inside of a campaign operation to know exactly what goes into these ground games, and maybe talk a little bit about what the campaigns need to do running up to both the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries.
Sure. So, as everyone may or may not know, the Iowa caucuses are a bit of a different beast than the normal primary, mostly because it's a caucus system which involves local citizens going to their local precincts on a particular day. They come together. There's generally some speeches. There's generally some internal stuff going on at the actual precinct locations, and then they essentially go to different locations in the building. And their numbers are counted, and that decides the precinct's essentially delegate count. And then that gets reported up into the larger state. So the key there really is turning out folks in all these different places to get to their local precincts, which is why you see so many campaigns, particularly this year with so many different candidates, really focused on trying to drive folks out. Because at the end of the day, turnout is going to be absolutely critical in these caucuses, which tend to actually have pretty low turnout because they're during the day, up until even late afternoon, and it's a bit of a barrier. You have to take off work or doing something that day, and you have to go and spend some time getting involved in local politics, which is always a bear. And also people tend to just not want to vote anyway. So you have a lot of basically intrinsic and inherent difficulties getting people out to the caucuses. And then, the biggest problem, of course, is identifying these folks and convincing them that your candidate is the most likely to represent their beliefs, values, and opinions, and then making sure that they're committed to you. And again, people can always lie. That's always something you have to kind of take into consideration when you're talking to folks and trying to get them out. And so that's why you've seen a lot of candidates really invest in a turnout operation. And what a lot of campaigns do is, they know they can't talk to every single voter. They can't go to every single door. And so what they utilize is kind of a grassroots system. Not very top down, but what you'll often find is local organizations, groups, churches, organizations are often tapped for endorsements. And from there, there's essentially a kind of a grounds up level of organizing where they'll use those organizations to spread their messaging. Not unfamiliar to what Obama did in 2008 and 2012, which is essentially a ground up operation, which is why I think for one of the many reasons why Ted Cruz has done so well in Iowa of late is that he's been someone that was highly focused on building relationships across the state with conservative groups, evangelical groups, homeschool associations, and so forth. Whereas Donald Trump has been really focused on a unique strategy, which is the rally approach. Actually, I think, for all the different things that Donald Trump might be, you do have to admit it's a pretty unique strategy that hasn't been done in a long time, really since probably the Reagan era, where he was really using rallies and town halls to advance his message, knowing that he doesn't have to spend the money on a ground game operation that was so, intricate and vast like Ted Cruz has. And likewise, he hasn't also spent the same amount of money that a Rubio has or a Bush has. So it's just something to keep in mind. As much money as Trump has, he's been really focused on this kind of town hall rally approach. And what they've done instead of kind of the evangelical group or the conservative group is they've really kind of started looking at the areas that have been hardest hit by either jobs leaving or immigration and trying to essentially convince those folks to become caucus goers in their local areas. And again, and this is actually where it comes into play, which is the caucuses are closed. So you have, your essentially normal voting, registered Republicans, but you also have these Democrats and independents. And so the challenge for Trump, if he's trying to draw off these folks, if they truly are Trump supporters, is that he's going to need to get them to, register as Republicans and go vote in this caucus system. And again, a lot of these folks may not be familiar with the caucus system. This might be their first time, or they haven't done it in a while. So it's going to be, a bit of a process to get them out to the caucus location. And again, he's going to need to make sure they keep their commitment all the way to the vote. Whereas the Cruz supporters, even the Rubio supporters, they're probably locked in and they know what they want to do, and they've done this system before. So that's going to be kind of the unique thing here with Iowa overall.
So you mentioned, these differing approaches. On the Cruz hand, utilizing small community groups, traditionally conservative organizations, church associations, things like that, versus Trump going to rallies. How much does polling play in the process now? I mean, you said one of the challenges is identifying who is kind of your legitimate supporter and then motivating them to go out to the polls. But I'm looking at the polling right now. Iowa, for example, Trump and Cruz are basically neck and neck.
Yep.
We have Rubio pretty far behind in third, Carson, Bush, Christie, Paul. But I'm also looking at the 2012 Iowa Republican caucus, 18 days before the election. I'm looking at the Real Clear Politics comparison polling app, which is great. And I'm looking at Gingrich with a double-digit lead at this point. Mm-hmm. Romney, Paul, Perry, Bachmann, and then Rick Santorum, who won the Iowa caucus, was polling at 6% 18 days out, yet he was able to win. I don't know if, Rick Santorum's running, at this point in the 2012 caucus, just as strong of a ground game as Newt Gingrich, who the front runner was, but obviously he was able to win. So how much resources are people who look like they're pretty far behind in the Iowa caucuses, but might have a chance, let's say, a Ben Carson, a Mike Huckabee, at this point in the ground game? Are they running sophisticated campaign operations at this point in Iowa? And do some of them have a legitimate chance to win, like some of the people who were pretty far behind at this point in previous cycles?
Yeah. So looking at 2012 is interesting. We also have to remember a couple of different things that happened in 2012. So Gingrich was, 18 days out, was definitely winning in Iowa. And then Mitt Romney basically dropped a nuclear weapon on him and basically annihilated him off the face of the planet, particularly in Iowa. Whereas at the time...
Wait, what's the nuclear weapon here?
He dropped millions of dollars in ads just attacking Newt. This is where... And remember, this was, the Iowa caucuses were held much, much earlier in the year. I believe it was like January 2nd or 3rd in 2012. So this was, essentially late December, and that's when Mitt Romney and the super PACs basically went out and just annihilated him with direct mail, radio, TV. And the Romney campaign knew that Iowa was always going to be tough, but that, they desperately needed to be basically either first or second place, and having, a second place finish to Newt Gingrich wasn't going to be something that really, met their plans. Meanwhile, as you were saying, Rick Santorum was basically all the way in the back, and what people kind of forgot here was that, he was running a very shoestring campaign, but he was also someone that was closely connected with, those evangelical groups, and they were all backing him, and he was out there essentially running a very solid ground game and convincing those folks that, yes, he was the best alternative to Romney for those that did not want, that Mitt Romney Northeastern style Republican. And he was someone who could, represent the evangelical, fiscal and social conservative, right wing better than Romney could. And he spent essentially 2 weeks in, probably one of the best ground games in political history, just basically saying, hey, make sure you go out to the caucuses, and was able to just win, enough, caucuses here and there to start making a dent, in the Romney side. And again, remember, Romney was actually originally declared the winner, and then when they actually did count the actual ballots, it turned out it was Santorum. So that was a bit of a mess, and that didn't necessarily help the narrative for either one of them. But that was something important to remember. And the one final point I'd like to make is Newt was fairly similar to the way Trump is right now, is that he didn't have as sophisticated an operation that most campaigns are going to have. He had an operation, he had media, had polling, he had his ground game, his political office. But he also was very much running on this media narrative. He's someone who is an extremely gifted speaker, knows how to play the media, knows how to play what Republican voters want, and was using that to his advantage. Not too different than what Trump is doing right now. So it's interesting that you're seeing 18 days out, once again another high-profile media candidate, in this case Trump, polling first or second depending on what you're looking at. Whereas you have Cruz, who I'm not going to say is the Romney of this operation, but is someone who is second place, desperately needs to win Iowa. That's going to be his state. And has begun to start blowing up Trump a little bit. So it's interesting to see that. And again, anything could happen here. Quite frankly, the Carson operation, maybe if it had been a little bit better staffed and a little bit better planned, and hadn't had the problems that it had early on, that might have been a campaign that could really cause some problems with picking off caucuses and picking off precincts. But quite frankly, Ben Carson, for as good as he's done over the past couple months, he's easily been fading away, and I don't really see him starting to really win the precinct battle the way he should. Rubio could pull it off, but it's tough to kind of see that right now. He'll probably be that distant third place, which is not necessarily bad. He is putting some time and effort into Iowa, but he knows that his play is much further down the road. So it's really kind of a two-person race at this stage. But that's not to discount the fact that there might be someone who comes in late in the game. And I think tonight's debate, this is doing this on Thursday night, or Thursday rather, not Thursday night. But tonight's debate could impact the way that Iowa actually pans out depending on what happens. You could easily have some type of Rick Perry moment, which will not happen to Ted Cruz. He's not going to be that foolish. But who knows? Maybe tonight's the night that Trump says something that is just, completely appalling and finally turns off those Trump voters. If he hasn't said it already, I'd be surprised. But you never know what could happen. I mean, I don't see Bush coming out and really doing particularly well in Iowa. I don't see Carly doing particularly well. Rand Paul isn't even making tonight's debate, but he's always someone that can kind of disrupt things because of the Paul network, even though a lot of those folks have kind of disbanded and gone into different, essentially races, notably the Cruz race. But, again, you can't really tell. So it'll be an interesting debate today, and then it will definitely have impacts on the way Iowa goes. But right now, I think it is a two-person race, and I do think it is probably Ted Cruz's to lose at this point, just given the organization he's set up. And, he's following a combination of winning playbooks, both from the Bush campaign and also from the Santorum campaign. So that given, I mean, it looks like it's Cruz's to lose at this point, despite the polling. I think Trump will probably wind up having the most difficulty turning out those folks that aren't regular caucus goers. But to finally answer your one point on the polling side, the polling issue is always going to be interesting because they're looking at now finally likely caucus goers. But again, if you're looking only at registered Republicans, you're missing those independents and Democrats that could actually wind up voting for Trump. So there's definitely going to be some levels of skew, I think, when you look at this election, this caucus in Iowa. So it's tough to understand the actual field right now. So I think as we get closer and closer to the caucus, it will begin to shake out, but anything can happen. And it'll be really important to just kind of watch the different polls, see if they start looking at independents and Democrats and just saying, hey, are you planning on voting on the Republican caucuses? And how likely are you to vote for those, and who would be your first and second choices? But it's just something to remember and to continue to look at.
So on the party identification issue, is this something that in Iowa, like, someone could show up to a caucus, be a registered Democrat, and flip their registration there, or is this something that they need to plan in advance? I mean, if Trump, like you said, and like a lot of polling has shown, has actually relied on people who are either not registered Republicans or explicitly registered Democrats, and obviously it probably varies state to state on this.
Yep.
But can you show up, day of, flip your registration and vote for Trump?
I actually don't remember the way Iowa is set up. I mean, you do have to be a registered Republican, but I don't know if you can do a same day party registration there. I'm pretty sure you can, but again, the big name of the game is trying to get folks already registered before they get to the caucuses, just because that adds in another layer of bureaucracy, and people may not want to even change their party, and that's going to be problematic. So I don't actually remember. I'm fairly certain you can't do it, but I'm not actually sure.
I wanted to ask you, and I'm not sure if you're all that into this network, but on, the Paul network, which you described, you said it's because I talked to someone recently who said they were shocked, that Rand Paul was not running very well in some of the early primary states where Ron Paul had very strong networks, very strong showings. I think at the end of the day, he actually got the most delegates from Iowa, which through, complicated delegate stupid process. But it just shows, the power of the Ron Paul image, his network itself. And someone was wondering to me, why hasn't Rand been able to capitalize on the network that his father built? And you said, they've either kind of checked out or they've gone to other candidates. So do you see, surprise maybe Rand powerful showing there, or is he just unable to tap into the same network that his father spent, years and years building?
So kind of what happened with the Ron Paul, Rand Paul network, and it's still there, and there is, I'd say, probably a sizable majority that is still with Rand Paul. The problem is that there was some scandals over the last year or so around, vote buying and who was doing what, if there was quid pro quo. It wound up not being anything of any real consequence, but the Paul network got a little beat up after 2012, and what you did see is the Cruz network start going in and kind of start picking off kind of those local leaders and trying to get them aboard the cruise missile, as it were. And, truth be told, Cruz can present a little bit more of an interesting narrative to those folks. He's someone who speaks extremely well in the Constitution. He can say he's actually, shut down the government and is a committed, advocate on privacy and, the various issues and the liberty issues that the liberty movement is concerned about. And, while Rand Paul can speak very eloquently and is very smart on those issues, he doesn't have the same, showmanship and ability to speak eloquently about those things and make it sound like it's truly coming from the heart. And that's kind of been the knock on him from that movement, is that, his dad was someone who was able to rile up, everyone and get them very excited and make it seem like it was very plausible. Whereas, Rand kind of takes a little more laid back approach to things, and that can turn off folks. And then again, when you add in the fact that some of those local leaders have decided, hey, you know what? I see Ted Cruz advancing, our policy goals a little bit more strongly than Rand, and he's actually, he'll probably back up the talk. And when you start then throwing in the fact that Cruz has done generally better than Rand in the polls, you start getting this bias of, well, I want to put my, my vote and belief behind a winner. And if I'm being asked to pick between two guys that have a pretty similar record, and one's very, eloquent, I like him, he seems like someone I can believe in, whereas the other guy, I know his dad's a good person, but he kind of takes more of a laid-back approach. He's someone that, like, maybe I'd go smoke some reefer with in college rather than, go listen to, lecture before the Supreme Court. I think those guys are going to mostly go with Cruz, but I wouldn't discount Rand Paul picking up from some areas and probably winning some delegates and having an impact on the Iowa race. But, quite frankly, the polling numbers haven't been there. He won't be on the debate floor today. He won't even show up at the kids' table debate, which Actually, I think it's probably a good decision if he spends it out, in any rallies or out front, fundraising. That'll be a better use of his time rather than essentially losing a whole day to a kids' table debate.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I think Cruz is going to be able to pick off enough of those, disaffected Paul voters, just because the Paul campaign didn't ultimately run as strong a campaign as they thought they were going to run.
So on that, you said it might be more valuable for Rand to be actually out and campaigning than go in for the kids' table debate. How valuable is actual, on the ground campaign work by the candidate themselves at this point? You talked about coalescing your network and making sure that all of these organizations that might be able to turn out the vote for you are on your side. And I'm assuming that most of that work is done by campaign staff or surrogates or something along those lines. I talked to someone who's a veteran of New Hampshire politics, and they said they were really impressed with the amount of time that Chris Christie is spending in New Hampshire, basically doing rallies, going door to door, showing up his own network, but he's not polling very well up there right now. He's in 4th place, I think, in New Hampshire right now. He's in 5th place in New Hampshire. So how valuable, and we hear about these myths of actually being on the ground campaign operations. The one that sticks out to me is the way Jimmy Carter won Iowa in 1976 was that he spent almost the entire year leading up to the primary in Iowa. So how much value is it for the candidates themselves to be on the ground in these states at this point?
So, it comes down to a couple of things. I mean, is it valuable to be on the ground as a candidate? Yes, absolutely. But it's the most valuable to be where you can actually make some sizable impacts on turnout. So it's about finding those, essentially not super weak, but weak areas that will essentially, if you put a candidate there or a really powerful surrogate there along with the candidate, really kind of start turning around, the support levels there. That's essentially what Trump has done, which is he knows that, he's not going to necessarily win the big cities, but he's going to win the rural areas, the places where jobs have left. And that's where they're going. They're going to the big areas where he can essentially, get some face time with folks. He's not doing these small level events where, he's glad handing everyone. He's doing that more large rally approach. But what that's doing is it's giving a sense of community, it's entertainment. He's someone that essentially is almost a Barnum and Bailey style, clown performer. He's someone able to can rile up the crowd there. Whereas Cruz will go to a slightly smaller event, but he'll also try to get into the crowd and do some retail politics. So at the end of the day, I mean, is it important to spend all your time up in the state? If you're not going to any of the places where you're going to actually make a difference, if you're not going to where you need to turn out, supporters and you need to gin up those undecided guys, that's going to be the name of the game there. And again, that's kind of what the Christie campaign has been doing is they're trying to spend as much time as they possibly can in New Hampshire, knowing that he is probably not going to play in Iowa very well. And he needs to just basically try to beat as many people as possible. So they're doing smaller events. But the big question there is he going to the areas where he really needs to be? Or is he just going to the areas where they can get enough people to make sense? So that's where the data side comes into play. You gotta see where your polling is saying, hey, you're weak in this area, but if you go there, you'll have a 20-point swing or a 15-point swing. And then if you have a good surrogate network, and that's what Cruz actually has in Iowa. He's got a great surrogate network. That's where if you have actually good surrogates that can actually have essentially enough support to essentially mimic the candidate, that's where you can have some good play as well. But quite frankly, the only person that's been able to do that so far is Cruz, and it's because he's kind of locked up the top level leaders in Iowa, notably Steve King and Bob Vanderplants.
Right. So obviously, surrogate's important. Let's talk about Donald Trump here. To my knowledge, does he have any surrogates? Does he send Ivanka to events? And I haven't seen, I don't think, any establishment Republicans, any elected Republicans, and maybe this is wrong. Maybe there are some small municipalities where there are Republican governors or legislators, not governors, but
Mm-hmm.
um, elected Republicans, let's say, who are on Team Trump. Um, Obviously, you said he's running a very different kind of ground game turnout operation than other candidates at this point. And what you said was probably the model. Now, how how is his ground game working? How do these rallies affect his turnout? And does he need to run an effective ground game at this point? Because, and I was talking to someone else earlier this week. They said, you know, a traditional ground game isn't as important for Trump because what ground games need to do is identify who your candidate is and what he stands for, and Trump is, nearing 100% in name ID and ethos at this point, and just ginning up the enthusiasm. And basically, it seems like there are no kind of weak fence setting Trump supporters. They're either all in or they're all out on Trump.
Right.
So does he need to run an effective or traditional ground game? And does this lack of surrogates the game hurt him?
So Trump's a different beast. I don't think he has any major surrogates. He might have some on an extremely local precinct level, but quite frankly, it's often, a very small, low-level person. And at the end of the day, remember, Trump is all about Trump. So he's not going to really let his message and his campaign, be defined by anyone but him. Which again, I think speaks to the rally approach because they know that, people are coming to watch the spectacle that is Donald Trump. Now, at the rallies, you can either be getting a combination of supporters or folks that love watching a good kind of train wreck in slow motion. But I'd say, it's important to understand that, there's probably a good amount of percentage supporters in those rallies. And it is important to have that ground game, particularly in a closed caucus state like Iowa, to make sure that they understand that there's going to need to be registration and to make sure to educate first time or having been to the caucuses recently voters, what the process is going to be. The problem there is, and again, there was a New York Times report out on Wednesday, yesterday, about the Trump ground game. And again, it's tough to to totally judge the entire campaign off this. It could have been just a couple locations, but it is telling that the ground game for Trump has essentially been pretty lackadaisical. They are using data. They do work with L2 data, and they have a couple applications that they're using. So, not to say they're not doing the data-driven ground game, but their volunteers and the way they're set up doesn't look like a normal campaign. So the question there is, they say they have a ground game, and they say they have all these tools, and they say that they're using voter contact. But the reports seem to be that it's not a up to snuff and not ready for prime time operation. So the question is going to be, and this is not something anyone can really tell by polling, and frankly, we really won't know until the Iowa caucuses close, is whether or not it was effective. The turnout model is going to, we'll look at that after the caucuses and find out whether or not the Trump campaign was right or wrong. But at the end of the day, what's coming out is, you do need to make sure you educate people where they need to go, what they need to bring, how it's going to work, how long it's going to take. That's something people tend to forget. If it's going to take just an hour, you need to tell them, hey, it's going to be an hour. If it's going to take up most of your day, you need to tell those folks, hey, it's going to be taking up most of your day, because if they leave, that can swing, a local caucus to, hey, Ben Carson, a Paul. It could go, haywire. Folks are like, I don't want to be here, or I don't want to do this or that. So, the ground game is not just making sure they show up, but it's also educating them about the process. And, that's something, again, the Trump campaign probably has not done very well yet. It is something I know the Cruz campaign is doing extremely well. They're literally making sure everyone understands exactly what's going to go and happen, and they're getting folks kind of ready and prepared for that. So, the standard way of running a campaign has always been the belief that a good ground game, a good GOTV effort can be the difference of 1 to 3 percentage points in a general election, and even higher in the primary or caucuses, just because of voter turnout models. So, to anyone to say that the ground game doesn't matter, I mean, I'd argue that, in a primary, 1 to 3% could be an election, and in a primary, it could be, a major impact, particularly where it could be 20 to 30%, swing, given, in a local area. So turnout is extremely important. Anyone who doesn't believe in the ground game can easily go look at the Obama campaign in 08 and 12, particularly 08, where he absolutely decimated Hillary because he knew that the ground game was going to be the most important thing to him, because he couldn't spend more than Hillary at that time. He wasn't necessarily winning the fundraising battles at that time, and he needed to go out and win those areas. So I think you do need to look at the ground game and still hold that up as a measure of success and future success.
Are we also in kind of a totally uncertain area when it comes to Trump and the Iowa caucuses at this point? Because one thing that I see kind of Republican-ish, establishment-ish, operative saying is these people who profess to be voting for Donald Trump, they don't really know or maybe don't even care about his actual policy positions, that he's not a traditional Republican when it comes to the economy, when it comes to trade, when it comes to all sorts of different things, and they don't seem to care. But I also saw, I think it was Nate Kahn wrote that perhaps Trump is actually underperforming in some of these polls because people are embarrassed to tell pollsters on the phone that they actually like Donald Trump and what he's saying. And the Iowa caucuses are a public process. So once you get into the room with everybody, Trump supporters, they could act like Donald Trump himself and bully everybody in the room.
Yep.
Or Trump supporters might be actually kind of embarrassed to be Trump supporters and go somewhere else. And it might be completely unpredictable where they go. So are we in a place where Trump is polling, I'm looking at Real Clear, he's polling at 27%. Could that be completely underestimating or overestimating what he's going to be looking at on actual caucus day?
Yeah, I mean, and you hit the nail right on the head, which is kind of the difference between phone and online voting. Trump does extremely well on online voting, and again, that might be the essentially candidate bias selection issue right there, which is yeah, I'm for Trump, and you'll say that on an online poll, you'll say that online where you're a little more anonymous, but when someone actually calls you up and they have your name and they know your phone number and they say, "Are you a Trump supporter?" You might say, "No, no comment," or "No, I wouldn't vote for Trump," even though deep down inside you might. So it's going to come down to on the phone on phone polls. I think you probably do have a level of some margin of error for Trump. He's probably underestimating votes there and shares there, whereas on the online you might be overestimating slightly. But as you say there, I mean, the polls are going to matter. They're a good snapshot of what's happening at a moment in time. They're not necessarily a great indicator of what's going to happen in the future, particularly when you have such a highly fluid race as we have right now, particularly with someone like Donald Trump in the mix. And so what you might see is, yes, in the Iowa caucuses, you're going to force people to essentially stand in a room with their peers, the people they go to church with, the people that they go and see at the supermarket, or the people they do business with, and they're going to be basically asked, who do you want to lead this country as a Republican nominee? And you're going to probably see a good share of them say, you know what, maybe I don't want to even voice my opinion at all. You'll get the hardcore Trump supporters, but then a lot of them might even just be undecided. And that's where Cruz can kind of pick that up, because Cruz, again, has always been kind of trailing off of the tailwind of Trump, even though they've started to attack each other a little bit more. But at the end of the day, Cruz represents a lot of those things that, Trump is essentially talking around, even when Trump's positions don't actually reflect it. So I think that's something important to remember, and I think you hit a good point there. And we won't really know until the caucuses actually happen. That's the volatility of the Iowa caucuses, is that you're asking them to do something where they actually have to put their essentially personal reputation in the community on the line and go make a public statement. It's not like a primary where you can just go in, you shut the little booth behind you. You put in whoever you want, and then you don't have to tell anyone who you voted for. You can even lie on the exit polls. You can lie to anyone, say, "Oh yeah, no, I voted for so and so." In reality, you voted for someone different.
Yeah.
We won't ever know. So the caucuses do tend to be, very weird, and I frankly don't think we'll know until the day of, unless something really happens where we see a marked, loss of support for Trump or Cruz. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to probably still people are going to be saying on the online polls, yeah, I'm for Trump. A lot of them might be also trolling the online polls. Again, you have to build that into the models for online polling and phone polling that
Right.
people can lie, or they're not telling the truth all the time. But and that's why you do the samples the way they are. But I think at the end of the day, when you're asking people, hey, you're in a room with your peers who you're going to vote for, that can have some peer pressure impacts as well. So I think that's important to remember, and you do hit that right on the head.
Sure. Well, that about all the time we have for today. Thanks a lot for joining me, Matt.
Thank you so much.
And I will see everyone next time on Blogging Heads, and enjoy the debates and the Iowa caucuses. Sounds fun.